Hello. So let's get started. Thanks for coming, first of all. I'm Will Olney. I'm an economics professor here at Williams, and I'm chair of the college's lecture committee, which helped organize this event. This is the first in a three-part series, so this forum is made possible by the generous support of the Cohen Fund and the class of 1971, some of whom are here today, including Steve and Janet, wife of C. Zimmerman. So thank you for your support. In addition to our amazing guests today, who I'll tell you a bit more about in a second, we also have on Wednesday, April 16th, Jamil Bowie, who's a New York Times writer, visiting. And then on Thursday, April 17th, we have Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, and David Brooks, a New York Times writer, speaking. So please flag those and come to those events as well. Today, we're focusing on trade and immigration policy. So these are arguably the two most important and potentially contentious policy topics in our country right now. So this is an especially timely topic, I think. And we're thrilled to have Emily Blanchard and Tara Watson join us today. Tara is an expert on immigration. She was a professor here at Williams for many years, was a deputy assistant secretary at the Treasury Department, and is now at the Brookings Institute. We also have Emily Blanchard, who's an expert on trade and trade policies. She was a professor at the University of Virginia and is now a professor at Tuck Business School at Dartmouth, and she was recently the chief economist at the State Department. These are both leading academic scholars who have published numerous articles in top economics journals, right? So they're very familiar with academic literature. What I think is especially interesting and relevant for today's talk is both of them have extensive policy experience too, which is quite nice for our topics today, both having that academic and then also that policy experience. So we're very lucky to have these talented economists here today to tell us a little bit more about current immigration and trade policies. We've set aside 30 minutes for each speaker, so we'll hear their presentation, and then we'll set aside some time at the very end, about 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Tara to talk about immigration.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be back. I'm going to talk about immigration. I've been given 30 minutes to do that. That's a lot to cram into 30 minutes, so I'm going to talk fairly quickly, and I'm going to sort of broad brush some things, and I hope if you're interested in any specific thing, you'll ask me in the Q&A. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to discuss where we are in terms of immigration. About 14 or 15% of the population living in the US was born outside the US. And if we look back in history, we can see that this isn't unprecedented. We had a similar period of immigration in around 1900, 1910. But what has happened in the past 50 years, and then even more recently in the past 4 years, has been increases in immigration that make it an important policy issue for the moment. So what I'm hoping to do today is talk about why is it important, why do we care about immigration at all, what's been happening lately, and then what's coming and what's happening right this moment and what's happening in the next year or few years. So the first part of this, the why is immigration important, I could have given this talk 2 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. There's some consistency in the fact that immigration is really important for the economy. We can also think of reasons that immigration is important beyond just the economy, but I'm an economist, so I'm going to talk about the economic value. One main reason is that the US-born population is in a period of decline. It's not literally declining yet overall, but we have declining fertility. And what that means is if we look at the population growth that we do have in the US, almost all of it is coming from migration to the US. So to the extent that we can turn up and down this dial of immigration, we're basically turning up and down the dial of population growth in the US. And that is important for things like labor supply, keeping the economy growing, and so on. The second thing that I think is important to highlight about why immigration is important is really a reason why you shouldn't be concerned about immigration, which is that contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, immigration does not seem to depress the wages or employment opportunities of US-born people. Now, it might seem sort of obvious that if you bring in more people and they're competing for the same jobs, that would push wages down. But if you actually look at a very large body of economic research, this isn't really what's found most of the time. Instead, what happens is immigrants create both demand and supply labor, and so many studies find essentially a zero effect, and some actually find a small positive effect. I'll come back to this point at the end. There are also some key industries where immigrants are extremely important. I flagged a few here. So on the left, you see doctors are more likely to be foreign-born than the general population. People in construction, home health aides is an area I've thought about recently. Farm laborers. So there are a lot of industries like this where immigrants are playing an outsized role. On the right part of this graph, you can see this is also true for undocumented immigrants. There are some industries where that labor is very critical, and it should be part of the conversation when we think about immigration policy. If you also look at the types of contributions that immigrants make to the economy, you see immigrants are disproportionately represented in STEM. They're more likely to generate patents. They actually, when they move to an area and generate patents, there are also more patents generated among US-born people, so they have spillovers. And they're very likely to create new businesses. This is true both at the high-end level, in the sense of the Fortune 500 companies are disproportionately likely to be founded by immigrants or their children, but also what are called Main Street businesses, so things like grocery stores, dry cleaners, and so on. So very important for keeping the economy dynamic. And then a fifth reason is stems from the fact that immigrants most often come as young adults, contribute to the economy for many years, and therefore when they enter are younger than the general US population. What this means is that immigration really helps us sustain our programs for old age, like Social Security and Medicare. And what you see in this population pyramid on the right, which is from 2020, is that immigrants, which are shaded in the darker blue and darker red there, are filling out that middle part of the age distribution. So they're really important for workforce, the time of life when people are contributing a lot to those programs, and less represented in the older ages. And what I like to say is if you're going to base your old age retirement system on a Ponzi scheme, you need to keep bringing people in order to do that. Okay, so those are 5 big reasons. I could probably spend an hour talking just about why immigrants are good for the economy. We don't have that time. But I'll also say, just in terms of the social environment, there's a lot to like here too. So immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes than the US-born. They have very high levels of social mobility, both within their lifetimes, but especially in the second generation. And of course, they're bringing expertise, perspectives from all over the world. And so that really creates, again, this sense of economic dynamism that's very important. There are some caveats, so I don't want to paint a picture where the economic literature is completely uniform. So we do see that there are some studies that find adverse wage effects for the US-born people with the least level of education, so those without a high school degree, and also for prior waves of immigrants. So that's a concern. And the other concern that I sometimes think about is the fiscal costs that come, especially when new immigrants come with less education. They generate positive fiscal benefits to the US federal government, but often impose costs at the state and local level, and there's a bit of a mismatch there. So these are both concerns, and they can be addressed with policies. My preferred policy is not to end immigration altogether for all of those other reasons I just generated, but I'm happy to talk more about how we might make immigration even more positive than it already is. Okay, so now I'm gonna, that's sort of the talk I would have given a couple years ago. Now let's talk about what's happening now. And I'm thinking by now, I mean the last few years. We have this legal immigration system, but whereby people come in either with a green card or on a temporary basis with a visa. And this is a very complicated system. So this is a graphic that the Cato Institute put together. They're a libertarian think tank. Now, I know you can't read that, and that's kind of the point here. There are incredibly complex pathways to be able to access legal migration. This Cato report that generated this graphic estimated that less than 1% of the population worldwide can actually find a legal path into the US. So that means there are 99% of the world's population who are potentially interested in coming to the US, but would not have any regular pathway into the US. So that's the backdrop here. That complication is coupled with very low numerical limits on the number of people who can come. So we have some pathways based on family relationships. We have some pathways based on employment status. We have a handful of other smaller pathways. But for the most part, these limits were set in 1990 and haven't changed at all since then, because Congress really hasn't been willing to engage with this issue again in a serious way since then. Over that time period, the US economy has basically doubled in magnitude in real terms. And we still have the same flows on the books in terms of immigration. So the legal limits of immigration are far too low. The system is also way too complicated. So that's one challenge. I think the reason that Congress hasn't made much progress on this in the past 30 plus years is that it's actually been very advantageous for both parties to use this as a wedge issue and not really to come to the table. People have been thinking about it in a purist way, trying to appeal to their bases with their policy proposals and not coming to make compromise. What this means is we end up with a tremendous amount of discretion in the executive branch, because what's written on the books is sort of untethered from what the economic needs are. So we have just this flip-flop every time there's a new president elected. I'll talk about why the current moment is, this makes it obvious that this is a concern, but I've actually been saying this since the Obama era. You shouldn't be having the executive branch have so much power, because it's not good for immigrants themselves, and it's not good for US businesses, and it's not good for civil society in general when we're just changing our policy radically every 4 years. So ultimately, this is really a congressional issue, and I think it's been an abdication of responsibility that Congress hasn't taken this up in so long. But that's where we are. So we entered to the Biden administration. That was where we were. And what you can see happen is that a lot of people came during the Biden administration. So there were a few reasons for this. First of all, there was a lot of upheaval in Latin America and some other parts of the world, displacing a lot of people, and many of them came to our southern border. Secondly, we had a really strong economy going post-COVID. During that time, there were a lot of jobs to be had, so that also attracts people, or when people are making this trade-off between staying where they are and coming to the US, it makes it more attractive. And once people started to see that the Biden administration was going to be more lenient in terms of letting people into the US when they did arrive at the border, that probably also fueled some additional people coming. So overall, about 8 million people on net came to the country during the Biden administration. And you can kind of see this number in general wiggles around from year to year, but we would sort of think of normal as being 1 million, 1.1 million. So this period, especially in 2023, when we had over 3 million people on net come to the US, was unusual. This is projected, but it's really just projected because we don't actually have great data on the exact number of people that came in. So most of the data is supporting, though, over 3 million in 2023, and then a decline since then. If we break that up, and I want you to focus on this other and foreign nationals, what was unusual about the Biden period was people who were not coming in through those legal pathways that I mentioned, and not coming in on temporary visas like student visas, which are in the light blue here, but instead this other group, which were, for the most part, people arriving at the southern border, making a claim for asylum, that claim being deemed valid enough that people would be able to come in and make their case in court. And so what we saw is a lot of people coming to the border and a lot of them being admitted on a temporary parole basis while they sought asylum. And the run-up here was one factor in leading a lot of people to think immigration's out of control, the border is out of control, and there was in fact a lot of chaos at the border. Part of the reason so many people were able to enter when making that claim is that there really wasn't time to do a quick decision right there on the spot, so people would get a cursory background screen and then be able to come in, and then there would be backlog court dates for them. So a lot of people came in. This was an important issue for voters and probably played a role in the outcome of the election. Okay, so now I'm going to try to talk through what I think is coming next. Given this backdrop, one thing I should mention here is that these numbers came way down, and that started last summer. So even before the Trump administration came in, the Biden administration had started to take steps to reduce the numbers of migrants, and that seemed to be effective in doing that. Okay, so I'm going to now talk through what I think is coming. So the first thing is we're going to have much less immigration this year and probably the next few years. That's going to lead to slower economic growth. I'm going to talk a bit about the implications of that for the way people behave in civil society, where immigrants make decisions, and more broadly than that. And there are likely some long-run implications, which are a little bit hard to foretell at this point, but are probably pretty important. So I'm working with a macroeconomist at Brookings, and the two of us sat down and looked through all the data and tried to figure out what might come from in the next year, in 2025 and beyond. So we obviously knew in December that Trump had won the election, so we tried to predict what would be a range of scenarios, and you want to think of this as like an 80th percentile to a 20th percentile range of scenarios. So it's not the craziest scenarios on either side, but some reasonable scenarios that could happen. This high bar, we said, well, let's imagine, and we had all the immigrants that had come during the first Trump administration, let's imagine that Trump basically does what he did before. Circumstances are pretty similar, maybe tightens things up a little bit. That's how we get this lighter pink line here. And then we went through policy by policy. We looked at the Project 2025 discussion. We thought about things that the executive branch can control versus can't control. And we came up with a low scenario. So again, this wasn't the worst thing we could imagine or the lowest we could imagine, but just what we said is, well, it's possible you could get to negative migration in a couple years. And then we said there would be maybe political backlash that would get things back on track. And then 4 years out, we basically have no idea. So we just, that part is no longer affected. So we said, all right, there might be a high scenario, which is still much lower than it was during Biden era. You can see the steepness of this line here, but would be kind of like what we had in Trump 1, or we could have a much lower level. So I'm going to try to talk through what's actually happened and what we can tell about what's happening so far in just a few months. And some of this we just don't know yet, honestly. But we can get a glimmer of one thing that's happening, which is that for legal permanent migration, LPRs or green cards, there's some efforts to put sand in the gears. And we saw this during the first Trump administration too, that you're just adding more paperwork, slowing things down. So probably fewer legal migrants will be processed, even though, remember, those numbers are set by Congress. And so really the executive branch doesn't have a lot of official discretion. Temporary visas are kind of mixed in terms of what the executive branch versus Congress controls. And these could fall substantially. For example, there could be threats to student visas. There could be changes to something like a readoption of the travel ban that was attempted in the first Trump administration. So we might see that fall a lot, still too early to know. And we do know that the refugee program has been paused indefinitely. So we had already predicted, even in that high scenario, that there would be essentially no refugees. And just as a reminder that the refugee program is a distinct thing from the asylum seeking that I talked about before. Okay, so another piece of this is people coming into the country without legal status and without encountering a border official. So unlike those asylum seeking flows that I mentioned before, there are, of course, people who cross the border and never encounter anyone. And by definition, we don't actually know the number of them. So there are a lot of estimates out there, but when people try to estimate this, they often look at this, the number of encounters, so the number of people that are actually encountered between ports of entry crossing the border. This is a little bit inflated in this period because of some of the asylum seekers just came between ports of entry. But you can see this has come way down due to a series of changes in border policy since January 24. And so our assumption is that also the number of people surreptitiously crossing the border has come way down. This particular measure, these entries without inspection, is known to be very sensitive to labor demand. So when the economy is good, people find a way to come. When the economy is not doing so well, there's less interest. And so we will keep an eye on this. It will be, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as we cut off immigration that slows the economic growth, which then slows the interest in undocumented migration across the border like this. Okay, so that seems to be coming down pretty dramatically, so many fewer inflows. And then we can look at the people who were encountered and formally encountered an official and came in. So if we look at the top part of these bars here, those are all the encounters. This now includes both between the ports of entry along the border and then at the ports of entry combined. And then we can look at the fraction of those that were admitted. And so you can see, again, even in early 2024, many people were coming in through this asylum-seeking kind of channel, which is giving people in general a parole status or a temporary status until their asylum claim is heard, not any kind of permanent resolution to their case. But that's come way down. Even while Biden was still in office, and then is essentially at zero now. There was also an effort to rein in some of the chaos at the border by introducing an app. It was called CBP One. So people could make an appointment instead of showing up at the border and saying, I need to make a claim for asylum. They could plan in advance that helped manage the flows. That app was ended by Trump. In fact, in a sort of what I view as a sad thing, he introduced a new app called CBP Home, where you can tell the US government that you are leaving the country. But this app is no longer functioning. Several of the programs that were in place for specific countries, so Ukrainians, Venezuelans, some others, have been ended as we had expected, even in that high immigration scenario. Okay, so now we're going to talk about enforcement. So this is, what I'm thinking about here is not enforcement at the border, because I've already covered that, but enforcement happening in the interior among people who are living in the US, who don't have legal status. So there are a lot more arrests than there were. Biden did relatively little in terms of interior enforcement. Most of what was happening in the context of someone entering the criminal justice system and then getting turned over to ICE. What's happening now is both more arrests and more at-large arrests, so more people being arrested on the street without necessarily having any criminal charge or conviction. And under Biden, it was much more common if someone was encountered sort of incidentally in the process of ICE arresting someone who is a criminal, that person who is encountered incidentally would generally not have to be arrested or enter deportation, whereas now, in general, anyone who's encountered is being put into the system. We can also look at detention. Detention is sort of the next step once you're arrested. for many people, they would enter detention, but there is a fixed limit on the number of beds, and that's been a constraint. So you can see just in the past month or two that's gone up, but it's just there aren't enough places to put people. So people are being arrested. They're releasing some people from detention in order to bring more people into detention, but there's there are constraints there. But what we have seen so far has not been a tremendous increase in the number of actual deportations. And I put a question mark there because we don't know, and we don't know this because the administration has stopped publishing their data about this. But they do these press calls where they say numbers, and so the New York Times tries to write those numbers down and make graphics out of it. So really we don't know, but my guess is that because the deportation numbers don't look very good is why the numbers aren't being very good from the perspective of the administration, is why they aren't being reported. And there are reasons for that. It's actually not that easy to deport people. There is due process. Even undocumented immigrants have some due process rights. And many of the group of people who arrived during Biden's time are still waiting for their asylum court date. And so typically people in that situation have until the court date before action would be taken against them. There are 3.6 million pending immigration cases in the system. About 2 million of those are asylum cases. And the average, last I checked, which was a few weeks ago, was 762-day wait to have those adjudicated. So people who came in 23 and 24 are still sort of in the queue. Now the administration is trying to push the boundary of whether they can get away with deporting some of the people before they get their case heard, but they really shouldn't be doing that. Once they do get their case heard, in general, historically, about half of people are allowed to stay, and then the other half are removed. So if they sped this up, they would actually be able to remove people more quickly. But instead of doing that, they seem to be firing immigration judges as part of DOJ. So this is actually probably going to slow down. Now, there are some people who have already had their due process, been deemed to have a final order of removal, which means they can be removed from the U.S. And those people can be removed quickly, and they've sort of exhausted their due process. So some of what you see in the news may be people who've actually gone through the due process already, but have just been sort of living in the shadows and have been found. So this is, when you see the headlines, there can be a lot of things that can be conflated, and it's just important to not jump to conclusions. But, however, there are clearly some cases in which the due process has been ignored or circumvented, and that's a really serious concern. Again, thinking about outflows, we really don't know how many people are choosing to leave the US on their own. We never have good data on this, and we still don't. We do have some temporary protections in place from Biden and before Biden that are scheduled to end and need to be renewed on a regular basis. And so those will come due, and I would say some of them won't be renewed. And so that would mean a lot of people in the hundreds of thousands who will, they will lose their documented status, but it won't, again, they won't be deported instantaneously. So it's sort of moving people who are in a quasi-legal status to an undocumented status. And that's gonna happen a lot over the next year to 2 years. Especially Venezuela and Haiti, the administration has already signaled their intent to end these early, although there's been some court action to prevent that. Okay, so bottom line, we don't know exactly what's going on. There's not enough data, but if you add up, I know you can't really read this, but you could go look at our report. If you add up the inflows and where we thought things would be coming, and you add up the outflows, I think we're somewhere in the bottom third of this. So we're maybe about 0 net migration. Again, the norm would be 1 million or more. It's been a very long time since we've seen net migration of negative, but it could happen this year. I'm guessing it'll be a slight negative number if I had to put money on it, but I wouldn't want to do that because, again, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And that's going to have downstream economic consequences for all the reasons I already talked about. Just to highlight this, I told you before that the immigration was important for labor force growth. If you look at the working age population, not the overall US population, but at the working age population, the US born population is in decline already. And so in terms of labor force, immigrants are more than responsible for all of our labor force growth. I'm very concerned about the general climate. So even though deportations don't seem to be rising as much as many of us might have feared, it's clear that they are more random. There's been some very high profile cases, especially including legal permanent residents, which I think, I know I told people 3 months ago, 4 months ago, if you're a green card holder, you don't need to worry about this. This is, people who are undocumented should be concerned, but green card holders really don't need to be concerned, and unfortunately, that turned out not to be true. As you know, there's a lot of discussion in the courts. It's unclear where things are going to go, but all of this I should just say all of this, leads to chilling effects. And there's a large economic literature showing that those chilling effects affect where people choose to work, whether they choose to go to the doctor, whether they send their kids to school. So there are all these ripple effects across the economy. And I would add speech to the list, even though I don't think there's been as much literature on that. I've talked to fellow economists who are not citizens, who are afraid to, being careful about what they write because of this. We're still in the situation where immigration is good for the economy. I even think the big surge that we had during Biden was very helpful to keeping the economy humming along as it has been for the past few years. It would be better if Congress improved the legal pathways so the immigration could be more controlled and we had more discretion over it. But that's still in the background, that we still need a reform of the system. We also have a lack of data, so the transparency issues I think are very concerning. This isn't just in the immigration space. We've seen this in a lot of spaces, that websites that used to publish regularly are disappeared, are under review. I think it's clear that this is a testing ground for the executive branch pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, and so that's concerning. But despite all this, this is one area where the administration is still very popular and people still are pretty happy with what's happening in immigration policy, and I also view that as a concern in light of the many benefits that immigration has for our country and economy. But I didn't want to end on a really depressing note. So what I will say is the courts are engaged and the administration is, to a large extent, not completely, treating the court like they have some power. So I am somewhat heartened that there seems to be some recognition that there are boundaries. There's also a potential coalition of people who should care about this and do care about this, including people with humanitarian concerns, people with economic concerns, people with democracy concerns. And I think as time goes on, if we do reduce immigration to 0 or under 0, what we'll see is the economic imperative will rear its head, and eventually there should be, that should generate enough momentum to perhaps get Congress to act. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of harm in the meantime. So on that note, and I know I talked very quickly and threw a lot at you, but I'm going to turn it over to a much cheerier topic of tariffs.
This is not going to be uplifting. I'm really sorry about that. If you wanted a happy, uplifting afternoon, you shouldn't have come to listen to two economists, probably ever, and particularly two economists that focus on international economic engagement and have worked in policy, and so we've got a sense of what's going on. So Professor Watson has been really crystal clear and very detailed. So I will be perhaps less clear. You can be the judge of that. Clearly less detailed. I'm going to go from ground truth to 30,000 feet to talk about what's happening with trade, but also investment, just broader international economic policy. And, whoops, oh yeah, I told myself to turn on my clicker and then I forgot. Give it just a second. There we go. Okay, so it's very tempting right now in April of 2025 to focus entirely on Liberation Day. So last week, last Wednesday, momentous set of announcements around trade policy from the Rose Garden by President Trump. And we'll get to that, and I'm happy to talk about that. But we could spend all our time talking about the changes in the US set of tariffs against our trading partners that we risk losing the forest for the trees. So I'm going to start not by talking about Trump and not by talking about the tariffs, but instead by talking about the already incredibly challenging global economic, geopolitical landscape that we faced in this decade. It was already an incredibly difficult, momentous time. So I'm going to start by setting the scene. Here's where we are before things got even more interesting. And I'll just say that's broadly January of this year. Okay? So I'm going to start with context to say this has already been a decisive decade. Then, after we've set the stage, I'll talk about Trump's tariff tsunami, right? What just happened, what it'll mean. I'm not planning to go deep in the woods while I have the microphone all to myself, and while I'm right here at the podium, I'm very happy to do that in questions, so feel free. I've been talking about this a lot, as you might imagine. I'll talk about the extent, the ways in which the protectionist surge is a spectacularly unconservative, it's a risk-seeking gamble. So we'll talk about what the gamble is, ways it could work out, ways it might not. And then I'm going to come back to where we started, and I just want to make a simple point, which is that to deal with the incredibly real and complicated challenges of the global economy and geopolitics, a go-it-alone approach isn't going to work. Right? So I'll talk about the international imperative and why working together with other countries, maybe not all countries at the same time, there will be power dynamics, but going it alone just isn't going to cut it. So that's the way I want to structure the next less than 30 minutes because I want to save a lot of time for questions. Okay, so let's start. Set the stage. The 2020s, I would argue, really in this post-pandemic moment, maybe you could date this back to Brexit and the enormous changes in the way that firms and citizens around the world are thinking about global economic engagement. Some folks trace that all the way back to the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008. However you date it, by 2020, we were at a decisive decade where countries around the world, particularly what you call the liberal democracies, think Western democracies, the G7++, OECD type measures, were thinking about things differently. And governments were thinking about economic policy differently. They weren't saying, let markets just go out and be efficient. There was a very real awareness. I won't just say a belief, I'll say awareness because I think this is correct. There's a very real awareness that markets and individual firms just aren't always going to get things right in the best interest of their civil societies. I'm an economist. I believe in markets. I think firms get a lot of stuff right, but not everything's priced in because there's a lot of asymmetric information. There are coordination failures that are possible, and there are a lot of externalities. Okay, so what are the strategic objectives that countries around the world, including and especially the United States, what did we need to tackle? What did we try to do with economic policy? And here I will sometimes slip into Biden speak because I did serve during the Biden administration, but it's really important to know and to notice and appreciate many of these objectives were the same or very similar to those from the Obama administration, certainly, but also the Trump version 1 administration and the Trump today administration. So there are a lot of similarities. So number one, a focus on hardening defenses. The world geopolitically is just way more tense today than it was 10 and certainly 20 years ago. It's a lot less optimistic. There's very real great power competition that's gone from a theoretical possibility to an undeniable reality. This is competition with China. This is competition with Russia. This is the outsized power of certain countries around the world, think North Korea, potentially Iran, to make trouble for liberal democracies elsewhere. I wish this were not true, but there's serious, serious challenges afoot. So one of the objectives is to harden defenses, thinking strategically, again, in the context of great power competition, or providing defenses against non-state actors. At the same time, you need to manage competition responsibly. So get that strategy right. How do you protect yourself without inciting or instigating conflict or making things worse? So this is one clear concern. The other thing we saw is coming out of COVID, got to protect yourself against potential supply chain disruptions if there's just bad luck, whether it's a natural disaster or a shipping container stuck in the Suez Canal or very low water levels in the Panama Canal that could cause shipping to grind to a halt, or of course a pandemic, right? So there's this hardening defenses, a real focus on reshoring. This was true with the Biden administration too. Number two, technology. It's changed a lot. AI, this machine learning stuff, it's real. There will be enormous dislocation. A bunch of, think about it as geostrategic, geoeconomic chessboards just got a lot more interesting in reshaping national security. A lot of these technologies are fundamentally dual use. Again, I wish this were not the case, but the same kinds of semiconductors or AI technologies that can be used for enormous good, curing cancer, can also be used for malevolent purpose, right? Coming up with bioweapons. So national security, brave new world there, also huge labor market disruptions. If we think the labor market disruptions moving from agrarian societies to industrialized societies 100 years ago, you think that was destabilizing? This is likely to be a lot faster and affect different sets of households, including and especially people like us in the room, right? White-collar jobs are going to be affected too in really important ways, and that will be destabilizing. Enormous potential gains too, don't get me wrong, right? But a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, we have very real concerns around market power. The tech giants are giants. Many of the big tech firms, in fact, if you look at the really big tech firms, they're bigger by revenue and even by profits and certainly by market cap than most countries in the world. This is enormous power for a non-sovereign state to have. So huge concerns about market power. At the same time, we've got concerns over privacy and information and disinformation, especially concerning in democracies. That's a lot to deal with. Oh, but we're not done. We also had governments saying, gosh, these 1 and 2 feel a little scary and destabilizing, but there are some proactive goals to our economic and international economic policies too, like boosting our middle classes, economic inclusion. So we would have called it inclusion under the Biden administration. Now we call it good jobs for hardworking Americans. It's kind of the same thing. It's saying we want to boost labor demand for certain groups of workers, right, in certain geographies, typically in the United States. The US isn't the only country doing this. Many countries around the world for a long time have used economic policy tools, including trade, but so much more, industrial policy, investment policy, to try to boost demand for workers, to carve out something meeting an economy that meets a social contract. We're not done. One more. Did I forget to mention the climate crisis? That's really important. I put an asterisk here. This was a centerpiece of the Biden administration international economic policy. There was a lot of focus on decarbonization, not only in the United States, but around the world. finding and harnessing new green technologies and sources of power, or maybe critical minerals that would support the battery production to meet those decarbonization technologies, maybe less a focus in this administration. But notice, objectives 1, 2, and 3 really similar, regardless of whether you're talking about the political left or the political right. And these things are really hard. They're also, the focus is pretty unprecedented. What we saw, again, beginning certainly in 2016, and even more so after 2020, is governments around the world, and again, including and especially in the United States, using a much wider and more powerful set of tools to influence market outcomes, to change decisions that companies made, or sometimes to usurp a decision that used to be made by a company and have a government make it instead. So what were we doing? Well, governments around the world were trying to shape where and how value is created, where and how products are made in the world. Think semiconductors, or vaccines, or masks, where ideas are created in the world, trying to harness and keep the frontier of technology, for example, in AI, trying to keep some technologies from going from one country to another country. So that could be something like the US export controls imposed in October of 2022, restricting the sales of certain semiconductors and lithography and semiconductor making technology to China. But it could also be the G7++ Western coalition saying, hey, let's not sell Russia after February 2022. Let's not sell them the materiel that they need to make missiles that they're going to shoot at Ukraine, right? So governments were using policy tools very robustly to shape not just security or military outcomes, but especially to shape economic outcomes. So we were using a lot of policies to reboot and rebuild supply chains. There were a lot of coordination mechanisms. Firms had a way to phone a friend and tell the US government, for example, if they expected disruption to their supply lines, if they were making personal protective equipment, who are you going to call? There was a place to call so they could get help quickly to unbundle supply chain snarls. This is clearly post-COVID. There were sanctions and export controls. Those are more prohibitions on what is sold to whom and why and when and how. There was new investment screening. The U.S. and many other countries, but especially the U.S., has screened inbound foreign direct investment for decades. There's something called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., any sort of sensitive purchase. So if a company wants to buy a port, for example, there's a long legal process, hopefully nonpartisan, to look at the details and say, is there a national security concern here? Well, two things happened after 2022. One is CFIUS got much, much more serious, restricting far more sales and looking more carefully at sales that maybe would have flown through before. But then something really momentous happened in 2023. The Biden administration announced new restrictions to look at outbound investment too, saying, hey, we think that sometimes it might matter if we've got our venture capital firms or a semiconductor producer or a designer investing overseas, maybe sharing information that we don't want shared. We haven't done that before. That's a big deal. That is a huge change. Whether you agree with it or not, you better appreciate that that's a brave new world of international economic policy, and that's the government going with big muscles into an arena where it just did not play even a few years before. We also had IFI, sorry for the acronym, I tried to kill them all, I did not. These are international financial institutions, so World Bank, IMF reform, getting those institutions to be leaner, meaner, more effective. Infrastructure spending, the US led something called the Partnership on Global Infrastructure Investment, PGII, or as its friends like to call it, PIGGY. Actually, we were not supposed to call it PIGGY. I got in trouble for that at one point. But really focused on boosting infrastructure spending to accelerate the green transition in countries outside the US, right? Saying their decarbonization is good for us because the climate is something we share. There's crisis management. This was everything from economic coercion by big players, principally Russia and Beijing, to commodities price shocks, to climate disasters. And to a lesser extent, the Biden administration, let's be clear, did this too. Left in place most of the Trump 2018 tariffs against China and other trade partners. Took them off against pretty much everybody but China, but left them in place. I would fought some battles and lost, but we can talk about how that comes back now. Okay, at least didn't raise tariffs until January 2025. So as promised, that's all the landscape. So what I want you to take away, if nothing else, if you fall asleep 30 seconds from now, is the global trading landscape and the US approach to international economic policy. I don't love this, by the way, as an economist, but I recognize its reality. It had already changed profoundly before Trump came into office, right? And I think that's going to get lost as we start focusing on all of the, and maybe I'm not supposed to say this, but all of the crazy that's unfolding today. I am a trade economist, after all. Okay, so January 2025, President Trump took office and began immediately announcing or threatening sets of new tariffs, but the big throwdown, the big hammer drop, was last week, right, in April 2025. This is a figure put together by actually Statista, I should have noted that here, using data from the US ITC, which is or has been historically a nonpartisan commission of the US government looking at trade policy. And what you see is the average effective tariff rate on US imports. So just look at the tariff rate on every product, cross-multiply with our volume of imports. That gives you an average tariff rate. Notice a couple of things. Number one, tariffs were really high under McKinley, actually. So President Trump does seem very fond of William McKinley. Wouldn't have known him personally, I don't think, though it's a close call. No, I shouldn't say that. Nope, not supposed to, sorry, editorialize. But tariffs were really high and then came down dramatically in the early 1900s. And again, this is not a class on trade policy history, but if you want that, read Doug Irwin's really amazing book, Clashing Over Commerce. It is incredible and remarkably riveting. But before 1913, we had not figured out in the US how to collect an income tax. So if you needed revenue, you really had one option as a way to easily collect it. It was trade policy. After we figured out how to do the income tax, we were like, man, these tariffs are super distorting, because they really are. They affect the prices that producers and consumers see. What is the likelihood that you want both of those distortions at the same time? Almost zero, right? So we got rid of those tariffs and adopted much, much lower trade taxes, so much lower tariffs, and had income taxes until, oh gosh, and then we start going into the First World War, really rough period. And notice, boom, right here, this increase, that's Smoot-Hawley. This is Smoot-Hawley. And the reason I pause here is because if you fast forward, this is today. Right, so we've talked about tariff shocks. Smoot-Hawley tariffs are often credited with extending, exacerbating. They're not completely responsible for, but they did not help the US Great Depression. Well, that is, I'll just do this with a visual. This is a lot smaller than that. Okay, I just want to be crystal clear on that. Okay, so after that, we realized, oh my gosh, when we hit with tariffs, our trade partners do the same thing. That's really bad for everybody, right? That's bad for us, that's bad for them. Boy, tariffs are really no fun. Oh, that does make sense in hindsight, because trade as an exchange is a win-win thing. You only make exchanges when both sides are going to benefit. So, of course, when we tie our hands and don't allow ourselves to trade with each other, we're worse off. So we learned our lesson. 1934, the US Congress says, Don't trust us with that anymore, right? We did a really silly thing. Mr. President, would you do more trade policy so that we don't engage in these momentous moments of tomfoolery with very high protectionist tariffs? And indeed, after that, the US and other countries negotiate lower and lower and lower tariffs, particularly after the end of the Second World War, the whole Bretton Woods Accord, right? We have all sorts of agreements that bring down tariffs over the course of the next almost 100 years. Many flowers bloom, economically speaking. Okay. And then here we are. Here's Trump version 1. You see tariffs bump up from an average in the US, an average tariff rate of about 1.5%. Goes down a little bit under Biden, and then boom, right back up again. Now we're talking about a 5-fold increase today-ish, if they don't go further, relative to the Biden administration era tariffs, which is a 10-fold order of magnitude increase in our trade barriers relative to 2016. As a trade economist, I will say that's a lot. Okay, so why did we do this? Well, here again, I want to give credit where credit's due. A couple of quick points. One, a lot of the objectives are familiar, right? Why? Something about jobs, something about national security. This has been a focus of administrations for decades, but particularly under the Biden administration. Very strong focus on manufacturing, even manufacturing jobs. Reshoring was a focus of the Biden administration, just doing it with subsidies instead of with tariffs. Also lots of concerns, again, reshoring, national security. We've got to make certain things in the US. So a lot of familiar objectives, but obviously the policy choice was quite different, using tariffs instead of subsidies. The analysis behind these tariffs, oh boy, this is a fun one. I'm being careful about time, I promise, Will. I'm being careful about time, so I will not do the wind-up doll, but if you want, just ask me as a question, what do you think about the formula? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? The formula that calculates the reciprocal tariffs on each trading partner. No, and no, so I could do that, so just ask me. But trade surpluses are a terrible metric of winning or losing. To run a trade surplus is not to win. You know this because you're here. You're at Williams, or you've graduated from Williams, or you're on the faculty at Williams, or you live in this lovely town of Williamstown. You know by diffusion, if nothing else, and probably economics, that a trade deficit, as a current account deficit, is driven by the difference between a country's savings rate and investment, right? It's got nothing to do with tariffs, yours or theirs. So this isn't going to fix anything, but okay. But I'm not going to do that one. So again, I could go on, but I won't. The other thing that's worth noting, there's a questionable legal basis around this, so you should expect court cases. You should also expect pushback from Congress that's going to be citing Article 2 of the Constitution and saying, wait, aren't we the ones who get to decide trade policy? I'm not sure this is settled law yet. Okay, implications of all of this. Well, I'll keep it simple. But the short version is we were not in December of 2024. This wasn't the geoeconomic, geopolitical landscape that I grew up thinking about. I'm a trade policy scholar. I study this stuff for my bread and butter, right? But it had already changed dramatically. And after January 2025, and especially after April, this is a whole new ballgame. Right? There's a lot of stuff going on. Number one, we've got a huge mismatch between competition and cooperation. This administration in the United States particularly, but not only us, really, really focused on thinking about the world in zero-sum competitive terms. But most of the challenges that we face, whether it's pandemics or climate change or responsibly managing powerful new technologies that we barely understand, or exhaustible natural resources, these are challenges that only work if you cooperate globally. Right? They're fundamentally global challenges, so they need cooperation. So that's a mismatch. At the same time, you have extraterritorial objectives. Governments care not just about the economic activity in their own boundaries, but they care about economic activity elsewhere too. I don't care just about my own technology, I care about your technology, maybe because of national security, maybe because of economic competitiveness and jobs. I care about the way natural resources are used because of climate, right? Or because of pollution, or because these things are exhaustible, and when we run out of lithium, do we have an alternative? We probably will by then, so I wouldn't worry about lithium, but there are other things that make me more worried. So extraterritorial objectives means thinking about your own country one at a time. It's just not gonna work, right? And then here's the hardest part. The policy spaces are really complex, and there's an important message, especially for economists in here, anybody who thinks really seriously about policy. We like to stovepipe. We like to silo. We like to say, let's think about immigration over here and trade over here. Let's think about trade over here and investment over here. Let's think about national security with this group of people and this group of agencies. But let's think about economic inclusion and prosperity over here. Different groups of people, different sets of conversations. They're not talking to each other. Well, every single one of those things, immigration policy affects our competitiveness, affects our trade patterns. You bet. National security affects our competitiveness and vice versa, which means policy is even harder, not only globally, but also across policy venues. And that's just really hard. It's fascinating, though. Okay, so the international imperative, we still have to work together. Why? I just said it, but let me say a couple other things quickly. Number one, industries are global. This whole supply chain thing, global supply chain thing, it's not going anywhere. Products, ideas, capital, innovation, it's all made in the world. It's gonna continue to be made in the world. You can swim with that current or you can try to deny it, right? But policy that deals with just one country at a time is just gonna miss the boat. Two, unilateral security doesn't work. Most things, like trying to keep dangerous technologies away from non-state actors, if one country restricts their sales but nobody else does, didn't work. The non-state actor got their hands on the dangerous weapon, right? Unilateral security is not security, period, full stop. You need allies and allegiances. Climate's global, enough said. And again, all of this comes down to it matters where and how value is made in the entire world, which unfortunately complicates ideas of national sovereignty and economic best interest. Going it alone is a terrible, terrible idea. So, like Tara, and we didn't coordinate on this, I thought I should end on an optimistic note. And you know, I'm pretty famous for leaving people depressed, and that was before April of 2025 and Liberation Day. So here's all I got, but this is mostly for the students. Hey, we live in really interesting times. And the demand and the return on your investment to engage, whether it's the private sector or the public sector or the nonprofit sector or as a thought leader or an artist, I don't care. Contribute, because we need it. Right? I do believe that this country, and the world as a whole, but maybe there'll be less self-immolation elsewhere than here, but like a phoenix from the ashes will rise, so you get to be part of the phoenix part. So thank you for that.
Thank you to both our speakers, and we now have some time for questions from the audience.
What is your opinion of the formula?
Okay, I'll restate the question. What is my opinion of the formula? And I'll give you my very short version, which I'll try to keep short. Okay, so the formula, just for those who haven't followed along, the Trump administration has justified the tariff levels that are different for most countries, individual countries. They're bespoke, very thoughtful for every country. and calculated the reciprocal tariff. The idea is to say countries that impose high tariffs on our exports should face our own high tariffs against their exports. Okay, so that's the idea. But it turns out if you look just at trade policy, if you look at other countries' tariffs, and even their non-tariff barriers, if you measure them, you'll find out they're actually pretty low. And they're pretty low not only on average, they're often very low for the kinds of products that we're not letting in for cheap. So for example, sugar, which is sort of a sacred cow politically in the United States, we have very high sugar tariffs. We're virtually the only country in the world with high sugar tariffs. If we were to set our tariffs to match other countries' tariffs, we'd actually be dropping our trade barriers, not raising them. So that was considered unacceptable by the administrations. They needed to come up with some other methodology, maybe that delivers a bigger number. And so what they did instead is they looked at country by country, the bilateral trade imbalance in goods, and basically divided it by 2, right? So they said, how much bigger are their exports to us than our exports to them? Now, there are a couple reasons why this is just an exercise in absurdity. I'm happy to say that on the record. It's a very silly thing to do from an economic perspective. Anyway, politically, that's not my circus, not my monkeys. But from an economic perspective, number one, they look at only trade in goods. And this is kind of a crazy thing. I mean, why not look at just trade in avocados, for example? If you want big numbers, the US exports virtually no avocados. We import a lot. I mean, then we're really losing, right? So they look at just at trade in goods. I guess avocados is a little sillier, but it turns out if you look even at the current account, the big 2 components are trade in goods and trade in services. And the US is a huge net service exporter. We're really good at making legal services and design services and intellectual property rents and all of that kind of stuff that's our comparative advantage would lower those tariffs. So no, they just focus on goods. So that's silly thing number 1. Silly thing number 2 is they do this country by country. Now that's goofy tunes, right? If you look at a country's bilateral trade deficits or current account deficits, country by country, of course you're going to see a bunch of countries run surpluses with the United States or any other trading partner. A bunch of countries run deficits. Actually, you can think about yourself, right? I run very large trade, current account deficits with every single partner of mine in the global economy, every single exchange, except for one, which is my employer. I export a lot of services to Dartmouth College that then pays me. I run a huge surplus. Everybody else, the Lime Country store where I buy my breakfast sandwich and my gas, they are ripping me off, right? The beer store down the street where I buy some beer, they're ripping me off. Netflix, they really are ripping me off, right? So you get the idea. Like, it's a silly thing to do to ask a country to run balanced current account, even if it were goods and services with every country, would be like a firm asking every customer and supplier to be both customer and supplier to equal degrees. It would be silliness, but we're doing that. And then silly thing number 3 is even if you add it all up, and here there's a little bit more merit, I might have a little bit of a conversation. You look at it and you say, let's look at the current account that includes goods and services. Let's add everybody up and look at the US trade position, current account position with the rest of the world. The US does run a net current account deficit with the world, which means that we borrow from the rest of the world, net. Is that bad? Well, it's maybe, I don't know. It's neither bad nor good, because borrowing can be for good reasons or bad reasons. This is true for a country, this is true for an individual. If you're borrowing so that you can invest so you can go to college, you're gonna have a great return on investment. You should absolutely borrow so you can eat today while you go to college, and then you'll be able to pay it back and then some. You'll be more productive in the future, right? Good reason to borrow. If you're borrowing so you can tell your parents you're at college and then go to the pub down the street, that's not so great. All we see when we look at the current account position, even multilaterally with the world, is the simple empirical truth. It's an accounting identity that investment in the United States is greater than our savings rate. There are a lot of reasons why investment in the US is really high, and it has something to do with the dynamic economy that we are, and the really high return on investment in R&D, in building new technologies, in educating our young people, in designing a better mousetrap rather than building mousetraps. So I think it's a pretty silly exercise across the board.
How do you think universities are responding to your point about siloing expertise? You know, there's an economics department, there's a political science department, there's a math department, when the challenges are really across disciplines. So how do are universities responding to that? How are they doing so, and are they doing enough?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it, but go for it.
Well, I'll turn it over to you. I would say they are trying, and it's probably not far enough yet. There's a lot of effort to do interdisciplinary work, but it's in practice, it's hard because academics have generally been trained in silos and don't communicate clearly with each other always.
Absolutely true. And yet I will also be a little bit more bullish in the favor of universities. And Williams is a perfect example. Long live the liberal arts degree, because nobody comes to a place like Williams and studies just in one of those silos. Students come and stitch it all together. So that definitely happens. So number one, I think that students are getting that well-rounded experience, particularly at liberal arts institutions, which is something we need to double down on in higher education instead of backing away from. And I don't know, I'm a big believer in STEM, but you don't want to go STEM, STEM, STEM with nothing else, because we need the knitter-togethers. That's where all the interesting work lies and all the insight lies. The other thing is you'd be surprised how much cross-disciplinary excitement and chatter goes on, you know, at a faculty dinner party, or if we were in Hanover, New Hampshire, where I am at Murphy's after hours. Don't worry, there's a lot of salt, sort of pot salting of different ideas across disciplines. And then the third thing I'll say is I actually think it's incumbent on the scholars. It's not about designing necessarily an interdisciplinary program, though that can be great. It can also be really problematic and challenging for young folks to get, say, tenure in that kind of department. Instead, it's about an interdisciplinary mindset. It's being relentless and curious and willing to veer out of your lane, but then crucially, go talk to the scholars who know more about this new thing than you do. And I think that that's alive and well. You know, if nothing else, academics are, they're pretty cocky and very curious. So we just need to maintain that persistence.
Yeah, over here.
So let's say a month from now the tariffs are removed. Then what happens? What is the trajectory of the economy looking like?
Less bad. So restating the question, just in case you couldn't hear. The question is, what if the tariffs are removed a month from now or tomorrow? Who knows? Maybe right now, unless you've been looking at your phone, could be. So the consequences would be much less bad. There are a lot of things that can be undone. I will say, and I briefly, as Will mentioned, I briefly served in the, or for a couple of years, it felt longer than it was. I served in the government as a diplomat. So I think a lot about U.S. economic leadership, our role, our responsibilities in the world stage. Like Humpty Dumpty, U.S. credibility is not coming back a month from now. So we can't just ollie Oxenfree pretend that didn't happen, because our behavior, our choices have shaken a lot of faith around the world in what the United States will do and whether we're true to our word. And I think a change in administration isn't going to fix that. That's going to be generational work for you. Thank you.
Yeah, question in the back.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the talk today. I'm curious, it seems like the Trump administration is pretty focused on driving down the deficit. So I was curious if you could speak to the merit, if there is any at all, in terms of tariffs and the new generations.
I love that you said the deficit. This is my other favorite saw, so I'm going to try to behave myself and keep it short. I bet you have some thoughts on this one too. Professor Watson sits at Brookings and so has lots of thoughts in this space as well. So when you say the deficit, notice there are two deficits. They're related, sort of, but certainly not mechanically, and they're really important to keep separate right now. So there's the trade deficit, or again, more broadly, the current account deficit, which is something about other countries taking advantage of us, according to the president. No, that's nonsense. But that is something about whether the U.S. is a net borrower or a net lender from the rest of the world. That's the current account deficit. That's about the choices of individuals and firms and, yeah, the government, everybody who borrows and everybody who lends in the U.S. economy writ large. Separate from that is the U.S. federal budget deficit. So that's, the Treasury position. That's what Congress taxes and spends. And the federal budget deficit is an enormous concern for many, again, left and right of the political aisle. And the U.S. federal budget deficit is really high. We're at about 7% of GDP right now. This is almost double pre-pandemic levels. There's a lot of pandemic spending that went into place and never really went away. There was also the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is set to expire this year. And if it is not renewed, which is what all congressional budget scoring is, if it's not renewed, then we're still in a world of hurt from a budget position. If it is renewed, we've just added effectively another $4.5 to $5 trillion to the deficit over a 10-year basis. Huge increase in government spending. And it's funny you should mention that federal budget deficit. We expect Congress will and should and needs to lead in this space. It is their job to come up with a federal budget. But they've floated just last week a budget plan that would extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They score it, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, scores it about $5 trillion over 10 years. They layered on another $1.5 trillion of tax cuts. So unless there are huge spending cuts, our deficits will go up even more. Our debt to GDP ratio is already around 100%, so that's a lot. And no, tax revenue is going to come nowhere close to covering that huge gap. So I would like to have a more serious conversation about the budget, but we haven't heard it from the president yet. We'll see. What do you think?
I think you covered it pretty well. I think people complain about the deficit when other people are proposing spending on programs they don't like, and they seem to wish away the deficit when it's something they do like. So the Trump tax cuts are very big. Assuming they are extended, which looks likely, it's going to be a very big increase in our overall deficit and debt in the long run. And we have this known set of challenges that's been known for a long time with the aging of the population, where we really need to be thinking about this, but no one wants to make the painful choices that are required in order to actually address this.
I wanted to ask about the immigration. It was interesting to me to hear you talk about how it seems to be limited, because it seems like it's just all over the place, and the fact that we are now using El Salvador, et cetera, to detain people without due process, without any charges being filed. It seems like it could be just kind of a tsunami, to use the word again, of deporting people, whether or not they are citizens, whether or not they have green cards, whether or not they're, I guess, and today the Supreme Court now has said that they don't have to bring back any of the people they illegally detained or sent to El Salvador. They reversed it to the lower court.
Yes.
I know it's hard to try to keep things on a level in times like these, but what is your...
Yes, so I would say the numbers are smaller than you would get the sense that they are from the media. And it's because what's happening is unusual, but it's unusual in individual cases. So the El Salvador situation, for those who aren't familiar, was that a number of Venezuelans without due process were flown to El Salvador to enter a prison there. The pretext for that for avoiding the due process was the administration secretly signed something called the Alien Enemies Act, which was the act that allowed us to intern Japanese Americans during World War II. And the planes had taken off while the court case was unfolding, and essentially the administration claims that they have national security reasons for being allowed to do this. Even though the Supreme Court did make a ruling today, I don't think it's over. There's still it's a temporary kind of let's dig into this more, as opposed to a final decision on that. But you've got the high-profile cases like that. You have high-profile cases of students or activists being arrested. You have, as I mentioned in my talk, much more uncertainty about who is at risk, which leads everyone to feel that they're at risk, because they, in fact, are. And so the climate becomes much more chaotic, scary, uncertain, even if the numbers aren't that big at this point in terms of actual numbers of deportations. So I think it's more about creating the terror. It's sort of like the way we think about terrorism, that it's more about creating the fear than it is about the actual, events that are happening on the ground, or the actual risk of an event happening to an individual person. So it's not a great time by any stretch, but we'll have to see if the numbers sort of catch up to the rhetoric and the what we're seeing on the news.
And you mentioned that you're not getting data.
Yes.
Sites are shut down. So
Yes.
how do you know the numbers are not going up? How is that determined?
So I don't know for sure, but the administration they will throw out numbers on press calls. They've thrown out some numbers that are both not big objectively from a historical perspective, but also not plausible given what we do know. So I think they're already exaggerating, and it's still not that big in terms of deportations. Now, as I showed you, arrests are going up, detention is going up. So there is a lot of enforcement activity happening. In terms of the effects on the number of immigrants living in the US, it's smaller than the effect on the climate.
To what extent are smaller economies going to be kind of screwed by these tariffs, especially that rely on primarily on the U.S. as the importer for their goods? How are they going to be affected?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. Again, if you couldn't hear, how are small economies going to be going to feel these U.S. tariffs? It's not going to be good. The smaller the economy, so the United States is an unusual country in so many ways, and I don't mean American exceptionalism, though I'd be happy to throw down on that too, but the U.S. economy is so much less open when you look at trade as a share of GDP compared to other economies around the world. I just led a course, the little experiential learning course where we go for 8 days to Vietnam. Vietnam trade is several-fold longer, gross trade flows, imports and exports, several-fold larger than GDP. Think of the Vietnamese economy as a bellows that is importing and exporting just like breathing. It is fundamental to the operation of that economy. And that economy has really been open to the rest of the world only for a few decades, since the reforms, the Doi Moi of 1986 plus, if you follow these things. The consequences of the United States putting a 46% tariff on everything from Vietnam are profound. They're going to see enormous costs and consequences. And that's just from the direct bilateral piece. Let's keep in mind that the U.S. is such a large actor in the world economy. This is often an unfortunate thing for the U.S. We sometimes want to go under the radar. We can't. We're just too big. It's like a big awkward elephant in global markets. Like, don't look over here. No, people are always looking. You're knocking stuff over no matter what you do, right? So the U.S. economy is really big. We're very likely to cause, even if the U.S. muddles through and doesn't have a serious economic contraction or recession in the next year or two, we're very likely to reduce demand for other countries' products enough that they see an economic contraction. And one of the tea leaves that you could read, that I read, and people way smarter than me read, is looking at global oil prices, and you'll see that those have dropped precipitously since last Wednesday's tariff announcement. That is a reflection of market participants around the world with money on the line saying, we think the global economy is going to slow down. And who hurts most when the global economy slows down? The very small, very open countries of the world. So it's heartbreaking.